With the NFL offseason just beginning, San Francisco completed their first week of OTAs, and with that, many players have already started distinguishing themselves from their peers. And I've already covered players on the offensive side of the ball who did this, so in this video, I want to break down players on the defensive side of the ball who really stood out. Initially, I want to look at one of their most troublesome positions last year, and that was the cornerback position. Ambry Thomas, frankly, just hasn't been what San Francisco built him out to be, and so far during this OTA period, Ambry Thomas really hasn't played that much better. But luckily for San Francisco, they picked up a couple of cornerbacks in this offseason, and those guys performed. Starting out with their second round pick, Renardo Green. He was extremely aggressive, feared no one, and even shut down a couple of passes. But this aggression did lead him to have one pass interference, so he needs to clean that up if he actually wants to push for a starting job this year. Especially when you consider the fact that San Francisco's other corners they added this offseason in Rock Ya-Sin and Isaac Yiadom are playing lights out. Last year for Yiadom, it looked like he finally put everything together with the Saints. He had 14 passes defended as well as 1 interception. And so far during this OTA period, it does look like Yiadom is carrying over that momentum he had last season. On their nickel defense, San Francisco brought in Yiadom and put Lenoir in the slot in a similar way they did with Thomas last year, the difference being Yiadom is much better than Thomas. For instance, one thing that really stood out to me about Thomas is how routinely he was beat deep. Yiadom, in comparison, was able to actually break up a deep pass intended for Deebo Samuel in this camp, so it's extremely encouraging that San Francisco might have finally upgraded off Ambry Thomas. In a similar way, I was pretty impressed by Rock Ya-Sin. He found the majority of his playing time on the outside as a backup, and he even broke up a couple of passes, including to their first round pick, Pearsall. Now staying in the secondary, but moving over to the safety position, Talanoa Hufanga is still rehabbing from his ACL tear, which left George Odom and Jair Brown to start. Meanwhile, Eric Harris, Taylor Hawkins, and Malik Mustafa served as the team's primary backups. The safety that really stood out, outside of Jair Brown, had to be Malik Mustafa. He looks extremely instinctual on the field, as well as being highly communicative, and I bet he pushes his way up the depth chart rather quickly this offseason. And the best part is, we haven't seen Malik Mustafa in his best element yet. He's one of the best tackling safeties across all of college football, and he's extremely hard hitting. So once those pads come on, he should only improve. Now moving off San Francisco's secondary and moving into their front seven, specifically the linebacker group, San Francisco has the big task of replacing Dre Greenlaw at least for the very start of the season. Devondre Campbell and Demetrius Flannigan-Fowles were their starters. While Campbell had a little bit of a down year statistically last year, he blamed it on the way that the Packers were using Kim, and so far during OTAs, he looks like an extremely solid linebacker. But there are also several rookies that look like they could push for a starting job, including D. Winters and Jalen Graham, so that's something to keep your eye out on. Now moving over to San Francisco's defensive line. During this offseason, they decided not to bring back Eric Armstead due to cap constraints. And while we didn't see one of their defensive tackles in Malik Collins, we did see Jordan Elliott, Kalia Davis, and Evan Anderson, and these are the guys that really stood out. Jordan Elliott, for instance, just looks the part. He has an extremely quick first step and was a vital part of the Browns' run defense last year. And in a similar way, Kalia Davis is looking like he's developing into the player San Francisco wanted him to be. He has an extremely quick first step, and thanks to his time as a linebacker, he's just so athletic. Now moving over to the player that I believe could be the biggest steal of this entire draft, or more so, an undrafted free agent, Evan Anderson. He's coming in from Florida Atlantic University, and this guy is built the part. Despite being 6'4" and weighing 330 pounds for instance, he's one of San Francisco's quicker defensive tackles. This was actually extremely beneficial in college, where thanks to his quickness, he was able to not just stop runs, but also get to the quarterback. But early on in Anderson's career, I think he's going to show on tape as a true run defender. He has the body that can just eat up a ton of space, and he's also extremely athletic. And if you're pairing that with Chris Kaceric's coaching, you have a recipe for success, especially when you consider the fact that San Francisco uses a rotation of defensive linemen, so Anderson should remain fresh. As far as the defensive ends go, Drake Jackson is recovering from a knee surgery he had last year, but San Francisco's star defensive end, Nick Bosa, surprisingly did show up, and they also have a few new additions on this line as well, including Leonard Floyd and Yetur Gross-Matos. So far, I've been pretty impressed by both of these players. Yetur Gross-Matos, for instance, reminds me of a guy like Charles Omenihu or Arden Key. They can put him in there on the outside for, let's say, first and second down, and then for those NASCAR packages, slide him over for defensive tackle. In comparison, I believe that Floyd fits a pass rush specialist perfectly. Last year, serving this role with the Bills, for instance, he matched a career high of 10.5 sacks. But these two new additions weren't the only players that really stood out. Another one was Robert Beal Jr. Going into this offseason, for instance, my biggest question for Beal was if he would be able to add the necessary size to be an effective defensive end. And so far, it looks like RBJ has not just bulked up and added the necessary strength, but also not lost that incredible first step he had. That, in combination with Chris Kaceric's coaching, improving his hand placement, you could see Robert Beal Jr. make a noticeable jump from year 1 to year 2. It's never been a question about Robert Beal Jr.'s athleticism, his athletic profile. It's just really putting everything together. Ultimately though, these are just my thoughts on who stood out on the defensive side of the ball during the first week of OTAs, and I'd like to hear your thoughts of who you'd like to see this upcoming season, who you expect to break out, and it would also mean a ton if you liked and subscribed. And as always, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.